Welcome to the God is Not an Asshole podcast. If you are one of the many people done with religious dogmatism, hang on. You might sense transcendence, but your church or other faith community never seem to get off the ground. You realize that honoring your conscience means more than fitting in and keeping hard-to-explain rules? Hang on. You could probably think of the goodness in your tradition, and you tried your best to save that baby, but there's so much bathwater. Join your hosts, David Norman Moore Jr. in California and Carrie Connolly in New Jersey, who are collaborating to bring on guests who have found life on the other side of fundamentalism. Guests with stories of how they have liberated themselves from beliefs that divide us from each other. None of our guests' narratives are identical, but we hope you'll find something in common with each of them. We invite you to experience our common bond as we all inspire even more of us to embrace the true self.
The conversation around the Irish, the idea of the Irish being the indigenous people of Great Britain and having been colonized, is a really deep conversation that a lot of my white-bodied friends here who care about whiteness and the way whiteness is in operation here in the United States we're trying to go back to that. We're trying to get back to that, our indigenous practices, and we're trying to recognize how much we've lost, and still hold the paradox and the truth of our whiteness here in the American construct and how that's all in operation.
So have you ever read the book by Noel Ignatieff called How the Irish Became White?
I have. I am familiar with the title. I've not read it, but I'm familiar with it.
Well, I used that in my classes back. I just retired from teaching in December. But I would use that in some of my classes a while back. I also mention it in my new book, Mission in the Cultural Other, my newest book. I talk about that as an example. But basically, he says the Irish, what was happening on the East Coast in Boston and New York and Philadelphia, etc., is that when the Irish came in, basically they were put in the same place as Black folks, right?
Yep.
And so in the same neighborhoods, same jobs, same lack of jobs, etc. And so they all begin to marry, right? And so that's why you have, so many Black people from the East with names like McGee and things like that, and so the gentry or the people in power in those places, the white, British and other kinds, said, we've got to do something about this. And so basically what they did was they created a path for middle class, middle management, if you will, for Irish folks. And, because they had to decide it's either going to be Black people or it's going to be Irish people. Well, so they decided it's going to be Irish people, right? And so they created, places for them like aldermen, like, firemen, like policemen. And that's why you have so many Irish cops and firemen, et cetera.
Yeah.
And they didn't ever expect somebody would be like a mayor in Chicago or anything like that, but.
Right. And they were allowed to be white, just not completely white. Right. And, especially as long as they remained Catholic, and kept their brogues, the one thing that they didn't get rid of. You can walk into an Irish bar in the Bronx, which is where I grew up hanging out. And, our music is still there and it's beautiful. And there is still the truth. I mean, I remember this was back in the 80s, early 90s when I was hanging out in the Irish bars in the Bronx, but there was still a lot of truth to the realities of the Troubles. And I remember one time literally standing there and what was called British propaganda. And I think it was about something having to do with the Guildford Four. I could be wrong. I don't remember. Came on the television, and I had a bar stool smashed up against a wall right next to my head because somebody got very, very angry about that propaganda. And, it's just it's a fascinating story to me. And especially when I think about the Irish Americans who are here, and who have tried to distance themselves from the brogues of their parents and from the culture in a lot of ways. And I also had an experience as an Irish American that here in America, so many of us who are white-bodied of European descent, we say, Like we have we say, I grew up in a town that was mostly white. You were either Irish or Italian. You would ask people, are you Irish or are you Italian? Meaning of Irish or Italian descent. And everybody knew what we were talking about. But if I talked to an Irish person, a person from Ireland, and I called myself Irish, they would get insulted. They would get upset by that sometimes, right? And so it's this weird duality of this place that I wanted so much to connect with my Irish heritage, and yet I wasn't always allowed to. And yet in other ways I was. So it's just fascinating. It's a fascinating construct.
Yeah. So the project of assimilation is constant in America, and to different peoples, it's different levels, right?
Yes.
So the only two peoples who just are not allowed entry at all are Black people and Native people. So we can't get in unless you're very like me, very light skinned, or someone who talks the same language, has the same values, someone like a Clarence Thomas, for example. And then you're allowed in most of the way,
So basically, you sell out.
And often used as a tool for white pseudo supremacy, right?
Absolutely. There's nothing they like better than to have a Black Republican, it's like.
Exactly.
So we should introduce you, Randy. In fact, I'm going to let you introduce yourself, but I want to say that our connection began in Oakview or Ojai, California, with Ched Myers and Elaine Inns.
Mm-hmm.
Some years ago at there was a conference around indigeneity and Christianity, and that's where we first connected. But then you have this book. It's not your most recent book, but I got this book and I couldn't believe that it's been out this long. It's been out a year and a half. And the title is Indigenous Theology and the Western Worldview, a Decolonized Approach to Christian Doctrine. And, the book has lots of questions. And I have a question in a moment that's not really the focus of the book. But first, Randy, say something about yourself, where you're from. Yeah.
Well, I'm just a farmer. My wife and I farm Elahe Indigenous Center for Earth Justice and Elahe Farm and Seeds in Yamhill, Oregon. That's about an hour southwest of Portland. This is our third rendition of Elahe. The first one was in Kentucky, and we were chased off after spending 4 years there by a group of white nationalists with a machine gun. We lost everything. And then I was able to get a job as an adjunct professor out here for a couple of years. Then I was hired full time. And then we were able to buy a second 100-year-old house and 3 acres and make it a farm. And then eventually, I gained, the distinguished professorship and tenure, and I retired as emeritus faculty after 15 years and climbed that academic mountain. And now I'm back to doing what I wanted to do all along, which is teaching out here. We're farming and we're teaching, and we have schools, and so all that. I've got 4 grown kids. I've got 6 grandkids. My wife and I have been partners for 33 and a half years now. And, I like to write. Of late, I've been writing movie scripts, and I've got some great movies coming up. If someone can pick them up, then, I'll be real happy about that. Then they all have to do with, disenfranchised people and, justice and things like that. So.
We want to talk about indigenous theology and the Western worldview, but you were just talking about how the Irish and Black folks, lived together on the East Coast, and, how some Black folks got their Irish names. And, I will have to find out, get more answers, but I just want to say that, my wife's maiden name is McLucas, and I have no idea, really the origin of that. I have theories, but I just don't know. So we will have to research that. Anyway, that's another thing. Okay, so
but that same strategy though is divide and conquer, right? I mean, in Noel Ignatius' book, How the Irish Became White, basically what you see is that it's like there's whiteness is the high standard in this country, right? And the British whiteness would be the first, and maybe Scottish and German and some of those afterwards. But basically, Irish was not, near the top of the list. And so, and my friend was right. Yeah. The Irish were treated like Native people were treated under British rule. So, yeah. And that divide and conquer strategy is still being used today. It works. And, and this is, divide the Irish people from the black people, make them enemies, create a path for the Irish to come up and become firemen, policemen, aldermen, et cetera, et cetera. And, and then they'll just be for themselves, and that's the project of America. That is sort of part of that whole myth of pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps. It's, there's a path to do that. If you're willing to sacrifice who you are.
Mm-hmm. I think it's really important to recognize and acknowledge the fact that, that while yes, because this is what I hear from a lot of my white friends when we are having my Irish friends when we're having conversations about racism and anti-Blackness and all of that, is that I will hear my Irish friends say things like, well, the Irish were slaves too. No, they weren't. We were indigenous, we were indentured servants, which is a very different thing. And yes, we had, we did have stores that said, or restaurants that said, no Irish, no dogs. Yes, we experienced all of that. And also we were able to assimilate into the hierarchy of whiteness very easily, to your point, by sacrificing parts of our culture and were. But I think it's really important. And, when it comes to the names, how many of those names were because of intermarriage and how many of those names were because of slave ownership, right? And so we have to be willing to look at the whole picture of who we became in the experiment of America, and how we lost. And I also often wonder, as we move on this moral arc toward justice, which indicates movement, I often wonder, is there going to be space for white people, especially of Irish heritage, to explore that Indigenous heritage? I don't know. It's a question that I struggle with.
Okay, so you mentioned the division, the intentional pitting of peoples against each other. And that kind of leads into the question I was going to ask you. 2 weeks ago, I was at the Parliament of the World Religions in Chicago, and one of the breakout sessions was on reparations. There were 3 panelists. One was Indigenous, one I can't remember, and the other one was an African American pastor by the name of Michael Neighbors from Evanston, Illinois, which has actually
that's Ku Klux Klan territory.
Yes, exactly. But in the midst of this, the city, and what was fascinating to me is that they started this effort through the churches, black churches and white churches, but they've begun a reparations initiative. And they've already distributed $25,000 to each African-American resident of Evanston. And they've created a fund where they now have $1 million that they're working out how they're going to apply this. And their goal, these churches that have come together, their goal is to make their city the first racism-free church in the United States. It's a pretty lofty ideal. But anyway, during the open mic session, and this is not the only session, I raised this question again when we were in the Standing Rock Forum, but I'm just really gripped by this idea of us being intentionally divided. And I want us to think about a framework where people groups whose objectives seem to be very different. And that is, African Americans have always, not always, but generally sought to redeem the constitutional state, have, kept pressing for justice within the system. And along with that, the call for reparations, not universally, but, a lot of people are calling for reparations. Whereas indigenous people in this country, they're less concerned about the constitutional state. They're concerned about broken treaties. And so because the objectives seem to be so very different, it raises a question, because ultimately the goal in all of this is decolonization. And I don't know what that framework would look like for, African Americans were so-called promised 40 acres and a mule after the end of the Civil War. But, the truth is even if that would have happened, it was stolen land. So that's right. It's not, what's that?
I heard Spike Lee on the news a couple weeks ago, and he said, we were promised 40 acres and a mule, but where do you think them 40 acres came from?
There you have it. Yeah. So how do we have a framework where we move in solidarity?
Can that even happen in a capitalist society? I don't know.
That's the thing.
So the problem is that, I think being part of the system and equality is a good first step, but that has to just be the first step. I used to teach a class called Transformation in Systems and Cultures. And basically the philosophy that I taught and believe is that, if you have two parents, you're only going to get children with those two DNAs. And until you introduce a new parent, you can't get a different DNA. Well, people who have been marginalized and disenfranchised have to actually be in seats of power and not just add to the system, but then begin to change the system. We need to recreate a new system. The system that we have was built for white people. It's always going to be that way. And as long as those are the people who are part of the conversation and in charge, they're always going to it's going to be the same DNA eventually. So you have to change the whole system and the structure. And so, equality and getting a seat at the table is the first step, but it has to just be a first step.
Yeah. What's next? What comes next, though? Because that's where I think the failure of imagination is.
Well, there has to be a series of things like there has to be education, freely given education, not education that's, where they ban the books and things like this. There has to be a public confession, if you will, or we could call it a lamenting process and speaking truth to power and admitting what's gone on. There has to be people from the other side of the equation who are guiding the process. So it's really hard for Americans to be junior partners. But in this kind of a reconciliation, they have to be junior partners. And then finally, there has to be reconciliation. But before that step, there has to be reparations. So the idea is always like, well, let's just be friends. And then the reparations never come, right? So no, let's have reparations and then be friends. Because why? Because that's what white folks need in order to save themselves, in order to heal themselves.
Oh, what do they need?
They need to give reparations. So it's not as much for people of color as it is for themselves to be healed, right?
Yeah.
Then there can be friendships and then there can be lasting monuments, histories written, et cetera, so that we can say, oh, now we're ready to start something new.
Mm-hmm. Well, who should be leading white healing?
Who should be leading what?
Who should be leading white healing? What does white healing look like from your perspective?
Yeah, well, it has to be people of color, and it has to. I think mostly it has to be Black people and Native Americans, because everybody is. I don't want to do the oppression Olympics, but we're the sort of originals who were wronged and still not recognized as human beings. So,
well, the white nationalist mentality, as we've all encountered, is that even having a conversation like this is dividing us. It is,
right.
you know,
We're already
talk
divided. That's the problem.
yeah, we're already divided, but I don't understand this mentality that to even talk about justice and talk about reparations and land back is dividing us. Where does that come from?
There's no understanding that. That's just, you know, sort of bringing out that old American spirit that, you know, was there for genocide and enslavement and everything else. That's just working that back up, right? So there's no understanding that kind of mentality. There just has to be a sort of a grassroots movement who won't stand for that kind of mentality anymore.
It sounds perhaps like what they're feeling is divisive is actually an attempt to silence their own conscience or keep their conscience from being activated. And so, you know, just be quiet and get along.
So this is why I, as a person who teaches and leads in this vein, working with white-bodied people like myself, I do believe that we need white leaders who are under the tutelage and mentorship and learning from BIPOC communities and Indigenous communities, because this deconstruction of our own psyche and our identity is it's a difficult process, and one that we want to defend against. We want to resist, you know what I mean? And I think it's really important that there are white people who I think it's an ongoing process of becoming, but who are going through this process of deconstructing our identity.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because it's a painful process to realize, oh crap, I have been a part of something that disgusts me.
Yeah,
you know?
and I think to get to your earlier question, you do need white people saying to other white people, aren't you tired of carrying this load? Aren't you tired of carrying this burden, this baggage of superiority and everything? Don't you want to be free? Don't you want to be healed? Well, here's the path to healing. Right?
Yes, 100%. 100%.
And thankfully,
but white people don't like white
exist.
people who do that. Right. But the thing is that white people don't like white people who are doing that. Right. So there's that.
I got news for you. They don't like Native people or Black people or anybody else who does that either.
Right. And there's I think that there is a specificity to each of those experiences, right? And there's a specificity to when white people are doing it. And I say this because I hear so many of the people that I work with come to me and they go, like, I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to lose my family or lose my friends over this. I don't know how to do it. And and I think that's one of those key things that's going to have to be addressed in whiteness if we're going to do this work. And
I've lost family. I've lost friends. I've lost jobs. I've been shot at. I've been threatened. I've had my family threatened. You know, we've lost our home. You know.
Yeah, so, there's a cost.
Yeah, it costs something. This is like, if you want to do it, it costs you something, you know?
100%. Yeah.
So Randy, I mentioned how this experiment in Evanston is underway and it's church led. I want to raise a question, a line of inquiry that's in the book that we mentioned, and that is, how can we help students and help people in churches to open up to a different worldview? Do we have to provide experiences? Can it be done through thought exercises? What do you say to that?
Yes. All that and more. I write children's books to that effect. I write regular fiction books to that. Now I'm writing nonfiction screenplays to that effect. I write songs to that effect. I'm using every vehicle I have. And, my Indigenous Theology in the Western Worldview, you said you didn't realize it had been out for, it came out last July, I think. So it's been out a little over a year. But it was given in 2022. It was one of the top 10 books by the Academy of Parish Clergy. So I knew it was selling well, and I was like, why? It was just me talking, and then we put it into book form. And it was a series of lectures up at the Hayward Lectures in Nova Scotia. And yeah, so there's something that people are, and I'm seeing people post about it all the time. I actually thought my other book, the second, I did 3 books in 2022. One was Becoming Rooted, which is more or less a meditational book. You take there's just a little short chapter every day and think about how to reconnect with the land, nature. And then I did that one, and then I did one called Mission the Culture Other. And I thought, well, Mission the Culture Other is really a lot more radical. And so I'm writing from a real place of experience, but the other one seems to be doing really well. And I'm getting people posting all the time and saying I've been really challenged to change my worldview. So I think we're just giving people tools to think about it, and to realize, once you start that, decolonizing process, you start, unraveling, the ball of yarn or whatever. And it just keeps going because you start seeing it everywhere. So everybody says, well, it's really hard to decolonize. Well, not if you just jump in and then your whole, the problem is everybody's afraid to pull those, those sacred cows. They don't want to, they're afraid they're going to lift up a rock. For Christians, they're going to lift up a rock and God's not going to be there or something, So, and that's a sort of a mealy kind of faith anyway. So we need to strengthen our faith and buckle up and just dig in.
Thank you so much for being here today. We are people who have left behind performance-based religion and the shame that comes with it. Maybe you have a personal liberation story to tell, and we want to know about it. Please contact us on Twitter at GodIsNotAnAsshole or text 805-703-8393. Because the world needs to know that God is not an asshole.